guys turn to Exodus chapter 3. I'm going to be looking at verses 1 through 10. And this morning, the message I've entitled, When God Calls Your Name. Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. I'm going to read those 10 verses, and then we're going to get into our study. You know, I love the Old Testament. The Bible has so many good stories in the Old Testament. Great example for us, application. And, this is one of the big stories that not only children's book will highlight, but our Bibles as well. You know, big turning point in the life of Moses. And so I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 10. It says, Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he held the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a burning bush, or a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Your name is important. When you were born, you were given a name. You may not like it, but you have a name. It's a name that you've been given. Obviously, it's what people call you by. When somebody calls out to your name, or calls out your name, obviously you respond. You know, when I attend conferences, they usually give you a name tag, and the name tag will have your name. And the reason why is so people can see who you are and call you by name, rather than, hey, you, excuse me. And so you have a name, you wear the name on your name tag so people can talk with you and they can get to know you and all of that. But doesn't it feel good when someone remembers your name? Somebody comes to you and says, hey, are you John? Yeah. Hey, John, how, and it feels good, doesn't it, when somebody remembers your name? What if perhaps your favorite celebrity or athlete, you're walking down the street and they call out to you, You're like, whoa, they know me. That's pretty cool, right? Makes you feel like, wow, I'm special, right? Or what happens if you're in jury duty and they call your name? How do you feel? Oh, boy. Really? Hey, I think they're calling you, dude, not me, right? It doesn't feel good, right? How many of you guys watch The Price is Right or know the show Price is Right? One of my favorite shows when I was growing up, little guy. What happens when their names are called, right? Do they sit in the chair and they're like, oh, good, that's my name? No, they go crazy, right? They go nuts, right? They start elbowing people as they're crossing through the aisle, and they get to the front and they're running down, right? And they get to behind that podium and they're still wiggling and they're still screaming, right? Because they're just excited that their name was called. I would be too. Be awesome. But you see, when we talk about somebody calling a name and your name or whatnot, God has a way to call out to his people by name. And when you look at the Bible and you look in Scripture, you see that when God called a name, when he called out his people by name, it wasn't because they won something. It wasn't because they were, in trouble, if you will. It was because God was about to do something drastic in their lives. God was about to change their lives. And so he calls out their name. And this is what we see here, is that God will call out to Moses by name. If you go back to Acts chapter 9, remember Paul the Apostle, before he became a Christian, his name was Saul. And when Jesus appeared to him on that road, he called him by name, right? Saul, Saul, right? And it wasn't because he was going to slap him on the hand when he said, why are you persecuting me? It was because he was about to change this man's life. And he did, didn't he? It says in Acts chapter 9, verse 6, he tells Paul, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. There's his calling. You're going to be told what I have a plan for you, Paul. That is why I'm calling your name. I'm doing something very important in your life. What about the story in Luke chapter 19, verse 5? You guys remember the story of little Zacchaeus? There's a song, right? It's kind of ringing in my head right now. My kids play it. Zacchaeus, a small man, and Jesus, because he was famous at the time, everybody was following Jesus. He was healing, he was talking, preaching, and whatnot. And so Zacchaeus knew Jesus was going to come by that area where he was at. And so he wanted to take a peek at Jesus. He wanted to be part of this crowd to see Jesus and to hear him teach and talk. And so because he was a small man, everybody kind of surrounded Jesus. And so they kind of blocked his view, right? And Zacchaeus was a good troubleshooter, wasn't he? Right? He figured, you know what? Maybe some of us would be like, you know what? There's too many people. I'm out of here, right? He didn't do that, did he? He said, you know what? There's a tree right there that has a great aerial view of Jesus. I'm going to go up this tree, and I'm going to get up there, and I'm going to see what's going on. So he actually did that. Now, what happens next is pretty incredible. Jesus says this in Luke 19:5. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up, saw him, and said to him, "Hey, you, get down." "Excuse me, sir, get down from that tree." No, what did he say? Zacchaeus. He knew his name. How do you think Zacchaeus felt when Jesus said, "Zacchaeus, me? Get down." Not only that, but I'm going to go to your house. Let's go to your house. Imagine if Jesus showed up today and said, "Hey, I'm going to go to your house today." What would you do? "Lord, I need to clean it first. There's some things in there that I don't want you to, I need to just please give me like half a day," right? I mean, Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' house, and he calls him by name. This is a man who was despised because he was a tax collector. They were known to steal money from people. They were actually getting rich off of people, a tax collector. And so here is Jesus, sees the man up on the tree, and he calls him by name. Not, "Hey, you, hey, get down, what are you doing up there?" By name. How special that must have been for Zacchaeus, don't you think? Here's a sinner up in a tree, and he's calling him by name. And then you know what happens. What happens? Jesus gets home, and then they have the meal, and then he transforms his life, doesn't he? Zacchaeus gets saved. He comes to the saving knowledge of Christ. Both of these men, Paul and Zacchaeus, were changed. When God called Moses' name, he changed his life forever. And this is what you're going to see here in a moment. This is the passage. In this message I'm giving you this morning, all I'm going to do is focus on the revelation of God to Moses, which I believe is the basis for all that is to follow from here. There's more to this story than these 10 verses I'm giving you this morning. But I encourage you to go home and read the rest of chapter 3. In fact, read the rest of Exodus. Because what I'm just giving you is just the revelation that God gave Moses through this burning bush. And so let's look at this, verse 1. It says there, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law." Moses' daily routine is described here. Moses was a shepherd. He had been doing this for 40 years. This has been his job. At this time, Moses was 80 years old. You know, it's interesting when I meet people that have been at their job for over 30 years. That's pretty good. Very faithful. You know, I think longest I've been in a job thus far is 10 years, K-Wave. You know, I was in New York, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this sermon. But when you find people that have been at your job for 25, 35, 40 years, like, wow, that's cool. Moses was at this job for 40 years. And we see that the life of Moses doesn't start here. We have to go back to chapter 2, chapter 1, and the whole story of what was going on here. And I'm just going to kind of paint a picture for you so you understand what's going on up to this point of chapter 3. The first 2 chapters of Exodus, we learn that once Pharaoh dies, the new king does not know Joseph because he had favor with Joseph because Joseph was part of the Egyptian kingdom. He was obviously, God used them to preserve the nation from that famine. And so here he is, and this new Pharaoh is now against Israel. Joseph is dead. New Pharaoh's up. New president doesn't like them. And now all of a sudden what happens is that the fear that Moses' parents had because of this new Pharaoh and how beautiful baby Moses was, that he was going to kill him as he wanted them killed, they actually took a step of faith and put their baby, basically they put him up for adoption. and put him in a basket. And there he goes, baby Moses, down the stream, hoping for somebody to get him. And guess who got him? Pharaoh's daughter. And then from there, he becomes part of Pharaoh's court. They train Moses as an Egyptian. And Egyptians were notorious for their fighting, for their army. They were notorious for their wisdom. He was wealthy. He was rich. Moses was living large. But that was not his calling. And he had a sense in his heart that God was calling him to be the deliverer of the people of God. And so one day, Moses was walking by and he sees an Egyptian and a Hebrew fighting. And so Moses goes up to them and he takes care of the Egyptian. Not only beats him up, but he kills him. And then to hide the evidence, what does he do? He buries him in the sand. Then he moves on. I did my job for the Lord, right? I don't think that's a ministry that would last, right? Then he goes through and 2 Hebrews are fighting. Hey, guys, stop. Guys, brother, you guys are brothers. Quit doing this. And what does one of them say? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian and bury me? And what happens? Moses is like, oh, they know. And he bails and he takes off to Midian. And then Pharaoh finds out and now they're after him. And so he just goes into the desert and he becomes a shepherd. And he begins to tend to sheep. He got a job with his father-in-law, tending sheep. And you know what's interesting? According to Genesis 46:34, it says that every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Moses was trained to despise shepherds. And guess what he's doing? He's being a shepherd. Man, what a crazy turn for him, isn't it? He's in a place, he's settled for less. And he's there now, and he's been doing this for 40 years. So Moses went from a member of Pharaoh's court to shepherding and living in the wilderness. And it was in this place that God speaks to Moses. Moses settled for this shepherding job. He probably figured that God wasn't going to use him anymore. He blew it. Do you ever feel that way sometimes? You blow it, you're like, forget it, God's not going to use me. Sure he can. He could use you. Have you read the story of David? I mean, we don't have to be perfect, but I'm not saying this gives us a license to live the way we want and sin all we want and God will still use us. No, we got to be careful not to go that way. But listen, God can still use you. And if you're here this morning, you're saying to yourself, I've been thinking of this for the last 3 years. I don't think God, but my life is right with the Lord. Listen, God will still use you. And we see this, that Moses blew it. And yet here he is. God is about to use him and send him back to Pharaoh. And so we see that meanwhile, while this is happening, God's people were being mistreated and they were being treated harshly and they were slaves to Pharaoh. And there's 400 years for that. So it's like God wasn't, according to them, God wasn't around for 400 years. God was doing other things, whatever, but God was always attentive to the cry of the people. And you're going to see this here in a moment. And so we move on from that 400-year period to where now God is about to do something. He wants to do something about the people's pain and suffering. And so chapter 3 is a very significant point of transition, not only for the nation of Israel, but for the life of Moses. God is about to transition his life into something else. He's about to pull him out of this shepherding job, and he's about to bring a new chapter in his life. When it comes to transitions in life, when they're initiated by God, I think they're pretty cool. And what I mean by that is because sometimes we as Christians try to initiate our own change, don't we? We try to kind of rearrange things and say, well, God's going to do this, so I'm going to do it, or whatever. But instead, we need to allow God to initiate those transitions in our lives. And we see here that perhaps you are close to a major change in your life. Maybe you're on a verge of transition in your life. Maybe you're in a spot right now where you feel stuck. You're in a rut as a Christian. And you're like, Lord, can you pull me out of this? And you know what? Perhaps God is about to do something very important in your life. And change is always good, isn't it? I know a lot of us don't like change, right? We always like to be in control of our little world, right? We call that a comfort zone, don't we? Everything is familiar. Everything is easy. We know things. But the moment God begins to pluck you out of your comfort zone, you freak out, right? Because it's an unfamiliar territory. Lord, I'm not used to this. This is all weird and new. Listen, change is very good for us as Christians. In fact, there's a change happening right now that you cannot stop. The only way you can stop it is probably delay it if you're in sin. But there's one change happening right now, as you're sitting here listening to the Word of God. Listen to this, 2 Corinthians 3:18. Paul says, "But we all, with unveiled faces, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord." God is transforming your life and changing you and making you more like His Son Jesus. That's the goal of the Christian life, is to be more like Christ, isn't it? And that transition and that change is happening. It's a process that will continue until the day you make it into heaven. There's not going to be a time where God says, "Okay, I'm done. You've become like my Son." You're like, "Yeah, right?" Like, we're all far away from that. But that's part of the transition of the change that's happening in our lives being done by the Holy Spirit. But in the midst of this radical transformation of becoming more like Jesus, there are life transitions that happen in our lives. There are things that God will do, and we see here that this is where we see Moses' life, is that Moses is about to transition into a new season in his life. I've had two big transitions in my life. Back in 98, even beyond that, before that actually, 94, 95, I went to Bible college, graduated, and I felt called by the Lord to just want to teach the Bible. And so the Lord began to give me opportunities to teach the Bible. I taught a Bible study to a family in Diamond Bar. Then I taught the Bible in Chino Hills, in my own home, my own apartment with my family. Then I taught the Bible in other places. So God began to give me those opportunities, and I was loving it. And then I remember one night in my Revelation class, I felt God speaking to my heart and said, "You're going to be a pastor." Okay, all right. And from that day, I start getting this desire to want to go to New York. And so I told my wife, I came home, I said, my wife was born in Cooperstown, New York. I said, "Honey, what's that place where you were born? What's it, And she told me the name. It was called Skinevus. No, I'm not sneezing. That's the name of it. And I said, "I feel, all right, let's go check out the place." And she had a distant relative there that was going to Calvary Costa Mesa at the time, or she did, but she lived in New York, and said, at the time all this was happening, she says, "I would love to have a Bible study up there. We need more Bible teaching churches. Would you guys want to come out?" And we did. We went out for just a week to see, "Lord, are you calling us there?" And He did, confirmed. We came back in 1997, and for that whole year, we prepared ourselves to leave, and then we left. We basically wrapped it up in California. We had a 4Runner. We packed up our 4Runner with whatever we could, and we drove across the states, wondering, how is this going to pan out? I had no job. She had no job. We both had money in the account, of course. We were ready for that. We lived with a family. I started getting a job. I got 2 jobs. My wife got a job. And from there, we started a Bible study, and it became Calvary Chapel of the Hills, which is still there to this day. 98, I said, "We're out of here." We left the palm trees, the sandy beaches, and the beautiful traffic, right? We left the road rage. Hallelujah. We're on to a new chapter in our lives. This is amazing. I had no thought of coming back to California. I did not want to come back to California if God ever said to come back. I just said, "We're going to New York. This is going to be awesome." We're there. And we were there for 10 years. And in 2006, I was at a conference here in Murrieta. And the Lord impressed upon my heart that you're done in New York. I'm like, "Oh, no." And I remember saying to the Lord, I said, "Lord, what do I do from here? What do I?" He goes, and I felt God say by His Holy Spirit, "Stay there for another year." And I did. I went back after that conference, and from 2007 to 2008, I just plugged away and just didn't think about it. I started teaching, pastoring the church. And then in 2007, in August, the Lord brought that same sense upon my heart, and it was stronger, basically saying, "You're done." And my wife and I started praying and fasting. Didn't know where to go. I said, "Lord, what am I going to do? I mean, I've been pastoring here for almost 10 years, and where do we go?" And little by little, the Lord began to reveal to us that He was bringing us back to California. I was like, "No, really?" At the time, it was crazy. It was expensive. That was when people were flipping homes like pancakes. Remember that? It was crazy. It was expensive. I said, "Lord, what am I going to do there?" So I called Calvary Costa Mesa, spoke with Brian Brodersen, and I said, "Brian, do you have any places at the Bible college? I'm a pastor coming back. I made it clear I'm not in sin. My marriage is great. Churches didn't kick me out. God's calling us back. Do you have a place for me at the Bible college?" He says, "No, everything's been set." I said, "What about K-Wave?" I was actually working at a radio station while I was pastoring in New York for 6 years. It was just my tent-making job. That's all it was. I wasn't going to become this radio guy. It was just a job I needed. I don't care how much you paid. I need a job. Little did I know that that experience brought me to K-Wave. And when I called K-Wave, and he said, call K-Wave, and I called them up, they transferred me over to them, and the GM at the time said, send me your resume. Basically, I was hired on the spot. And it blew me away. I'm like, wait, do you want to see who I am? And what they were looking, and what I found out is with Pastor Chuck and the GM, they were looking for a director for the new K-Wave Spanish. If you remember the K-Wave Spanish, if you do, it was a while ago. It was only lasted for like 3-4 years. I was on HD channel. And they were looking for a pastor who had radio experience. And all they were getting is pastors with no radio experience, or they were getting a radio experience guy with no pastoral heart. And here I call, hello, here I am, This guy's got 6 years of radio, and he's been pastoring. You're hired. And that brought me back to California. And that was a huge transition. Not just the time that I left here to go to New York, but leaving New York to come back here. I say, God is not done transitioning me. So I'm holding on like I'm holding onto this pulpit, you know what I mean? He's not done, but it was an incredible transition. And we see here that in the life of Moses, God is about to transition his life into something more than just shepherding, into walking around a dusty desert with stinking sheep, you know what I mean? And here he is, and notice what happens in verse 1. Notice what it says here. He says that Moses was tending the flock, and it says there that as he was there, notice, he led the flock to the back of the desert. This was all being designed by God here, if you will. This is something that is important. This tells us that the day started out like any other day for Moses. It was business as usual. And there was no expectation for anything out of the ordinary. He was just doing his job. After 40 years, Moses' life had become all too predictable. Year in and year out, he knew what he did. He knew how he'd go about his business. It was the same terrain, it was the same sheep, and it was the same smell. It was just that. And so we see that he knew all the grazing places. He had the exact location of every water hole. He actually knew everything. It was all etched in his mind. He knew that area very, very well. Maybe on occasion, a snake or a wild beast offered the only entertainment for him. But everything else was very predictable. In the solitude of the desert, in this wilderness, Moses perhaps talked to himself, talked to his sheep because he was a shepherd. But little did he know that today, that day here in chapter 3, was going to be the beginning of a new chapter in his life. And it's interesting to me because those 40 years of Moses were not wasted years. They were years of preparation. God was preparing his heart, his life. They were valuable years. And that's one thing that excites me about God, is that you never know when God is going to show up in your life. And perhaps you're in a place right now where you feel like you're spinning your wheels as a Christian. You're at a job that you're like, I can't believe I'm here. And you know what? God is not wasting your time there. He is doing something. Even if you feel like you're wasting your time being there, nothing is wasted with God. You know what I mean? And so I would say, hang on. You see, I could have said that my experience as a radio person in New York was just a waste. It was insignificant because it was just a job I needed. Little did I know that that experience was what got me here, and to give me my job at K-Wave. And so we see here that this is something that is important for us, because if you're desiring a new chapter in your life, perhaps God is going to show up in your life today, this week, next week. And it's in the ordinary days, not in the big days. But you got to be patient, and you got to remain faithful. And so we see very clearly that this chapter is more than just the account of a life-changing incident in the life of Moses. This is actually a crucial turning point in the history of the nation of Israel. God is going to bail them out of Egypt. The burning bush marks the beginning of God's direct intervention into the affairs of history. And so what happens? Notice where he's at. There's a place called Horeb. It's another name for Mount Sinai. And some commentators believe there were two places, and some say that it was one mountain with two peaks. Horeb was the region where this took place. It was a big region, but it doesn't really matter, because it was the place God chose to reveal himself to Moses. It was a special place, so you will see this here in a moment. But the name of it, notice, Horeb, the mountain of God. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that sound intimidating? It's like, don't touch it. A mountain of God. Why is it the mountain of God? You know why God chose this place to reveal himself to Moses? It's because a lot of things happened here. It was here that God got Aaron together with Moses. It was here that God revealed the law, the Ten Commandments to Moses. It was here that many things happened in the life of Israel, and so it became the mountain of God. It was his mountain. And so as Moses is there, notice in verse 2, it says that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. Wow. This gets exciting now. I mean, this is one of those things where you're like, Moses is doing his thing, and all of a sudden, it says the angel of the Lord appears to him. This appears only in the New Testament, and it's often described as this angel of the Lord is described as speaking on behalf of God. Some believe this is a theophany, an appearance of God in the Old Testament to man, or a Christophany, an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. And so, they go back and forth with what is this or that. But what we know here for sure is that God reveals himself to Moses in a very radical way. And God reveals himself to Moses, and he reveals three things to Moses. One, God reveals his heart. He shares with Moses about the condition of his people. He hears them. He knows where they're at. The second thing he reveals to Moses is that he reveals the promised land. He says that I'm going to pluck these guys out of Egypt, and I'm going to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey. And the third thing he reveals to Moses is that Moses had a calling in his life. You're going to go back to California. No, joking. You're going to go back to Pharaoh. That was his California probably. You're going back to Pharaoh. So he reveals his heart to Moses. He reveals the promised land, a promise to Moses, and he reveals his purpose for Moses. It wasn't that God wanted him just to go and to talk to Pharaoh to say, let my people go, and then Moses was going to go back to his shepherding job. No, your shepherding job is over. Now what you're going to do is, instead of shepherding sheep, you're going to shepherd people. Our people, I think, are a little bit more messier than sheep, don't you think? Don't you find it ironic that God calls us sheep? I always wondered, why don't you call us tigers and lions, bears? If you know about sheep, sheep are not that smart. They're creatures of habit, to be honest with you. They're very messy. And if you've been living your life a long time, you know things can get messy as human beings, right? A lot of drama, a lot of things happen. I mean, you look at social media, forget it, right? They're the sheep, killing each other, right? But you wonder, here's Moses used to sheep, now he's going to lead people. And we see that God appears to him, and notice he appears to him in a flame of fire. That's pretty wild. A flame of fire. When it comes to the Bible, fire in the Bible is a symbol of God's presence. Did you know that? Let me give you 3 examples in how it's used. In Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 and 22, God appeared to the children of Israel at night by a pillar of fire, pointing to his presence. You follow it. When you see that, follow it. And then in the daytime, it was a pillar of cloud, which is another symbol of God's presence. Jesus is coming back on clouds. When he left back up into heaven, he disappeared through a cloud. So that's another symbol of God's presence. Exodus chapter 19, God's presence on Mount Sinai came, and there was fire on it. In Exodus 40, verse 38, the tabernacle contained fire, another symbol of God's presence. The Bible describes God in the New Testament as a consuming fire. That doesn't sound nice, does it? God is a consuming fire. Hebrews 12:29. So it's not surprising that fire often appears as a symbol of God's presence. Now, in the New Testament, it's different. In the New Testament, fire is a wonderful thing because it's a picture of the work of the Holy Spirit, which cleanses us and purifies us like fire. He works in us. The Holy Spirit is the presence of God as it indwells in our hearts as the believer, cleansing us, purifying us. And so God appears to Moses in a flame of fire in a burning bush. And notice verse 2, what it says. So when the angel appeared, notice, so he looked. That's an important word. Moses looked. You want to underline that word. The burning bush wasn't anything new. Moses was there in the desert. He's seen many fires before. This is a desert bush. It's a big deal. It's burning. So you move on. Let it burn up, right? But something drew his attention. What caught his attention was that the bush was not burning up. That must have been a very wild thing to see. No smoke, just a flame, a bright flame just burning there. I mean, that would have probably made you like, what? Where's the smoke? And so it says that he looked. That means that God grabbed his attention. God is working his way here through this process so that the moment that he gets Moses where he needs to be, that's when God calls his name. Listen, God has ways to grab your attention too. It may be different from the person sitting next to you. If you're hard-headed like me, there's ways that God can get our attention, and he does it in different ways. That's the uniqueness of God, is that God has a way to get your attention. And so he is faithful to do that. And so Moses here God is doing this to Moses. Moses was going about his business. It was a normal day. He had no idea that God was about to show up in his life. And God called Moses on an ordinary day. He was working. You're going to have an ordinary day tomorrow at work. You already know what you're going to do. The time you wake up, how many cups of coffee you're going to have. You know the emails you're going to be looking at, the files you're going to be going through, the meetings you're going to be attending. You already know what your boss wants you to do at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Your day is an ordinary day. There's nothing special. It's predictable, right? And we see this is what was happening in the life of Moses. It was an ordinary day that God showed up. And God will never warn you when he's going to show up in an ordinary day. You're not going to wake up in the morning and God's going to say, hey, today at 3 I'm going to show up, so get ready. He won't do that. But he is faithful to get to you. He is faithful to grab your attention and to speak to you. Whatever message he wants to bring to you, he knows how to get that to you. And you're going to see here, I'm going to talk more about this, how incredible it was here with Moses. But when we talk about God moving in our lives, speaking in our lives, we think of conferences and retreats, don't we? You feel dry spiritually, like, you know what, I want to go to this retreat. I want to hear from the Lord. I want the Lord to speak to me. So we go to retreats, we go to conferences and whatnot. Those are all good. And God does speak. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. But sometimes we think that for us to hear God, that we limit God only to retreats and conferences. But did you know that God can speak to you in an ordinary day at work? That could be your retreat. God will speak to you on a regular day. And so we see here that this is an important thing for us to know that God has ways to choose an ordinary day to show up in your life. It could be at your house. It could be at your school. It could be at your job. It could be while you're jogging or while you're grocery shopping. God can show up and speak to you and reveal himself to you in a way that will just be incredible and radical like we see here. You know, Gideon was one who was going about his daily routine. And it says this, while he was doing his thing, it says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him. What was he doing? He was threshing wheat in the winepress, trying to hide it from the Midianites. And God, boom, shows up. He wasn't up on top of a mountain waiting for the Lord to speak, right? No, he's doing his job, doing his thing, and God speaks. Isn't that awesome about the Lord? He's not limited to just special days, special things. It's go about your day. I will get your attention. I will speak to you. And so, verse 3, Moses said he looked, and notice what he says. I will now see why the bush does not burn. I mean, he's reasoning with himself like, man, this is weird. I mean, I'm used to fires. I've seen bushes burn. But this one is, I'm going to go see what this is. So here he's coming towards the bush now. I don't know how many of you guys would probably do that. I don't know. I might have. I might have done that, but maybe some of you are like, I'm out of here. I'm weird about this, right? He goes to the bush. Notice, it snapped him out of his thoughts. You got to remember that as a shepherd's mind had to be distracted, or couldn't be distracted, but also it was bogged down with a lot of things. For example, they had to keep their eye on the sheep. They had to also at the same time make sure that no predators would come in to eat one of the sheep. He was also leading the sheep, so he was making sure they were on a good path. And he was also himself watching out for his own life that he wouldn't step on a snake or something that would bite him and kill him. So his mind was scattered. He was scanning and everything. And God had to somehow bring that mind to one focus. Have you ever been at work and your mind's like everywhere? I mean, you don't even have time to eat, right? Lunch? You're like, I got so many things going on right now. I just got to focus on this, and you forget to eat lunch, or you maybe, oh, shoot, it's 6 o'clock. I got to get out of here, right? Your mind gets so bogged down with work, right? That's the way it was for a shepherd. Their minds are bogged down. They got so much going on. So God had to somehow calm that mind, do something to get him focused on one thing. And God used a bush. And he got Moses right to where God wanted him. I'm going to look and see. All of a sudden, his job went, forget the sheep right now. What's going on here? And the moment he approaches this place, it was this divine distraction. And he comes to it. And notice, that's where God speaks. You know, I think divine distractions are important in our lives. I think we should welcome divine distractions. When God distracts us, when God wants to break into those thoughts, perhaps you have negative thoughts towards God, perhaps you have negative thoughts towards people, God says, you know what, I need to break through those thoughts. I need to interrupt you, because that's not the way you're supposed to be thinking. And here he is breaking through Moses' thoughts. This was an unexpected source of revelation. And so we see God is beginning to speak to him. He's going to call out to him. And I think it's important here. We see that it's important for Moses to be ready to receive what God has for him. And notice in verse 4, here's where it happens. Notice. Right when God has him where he needs to be, it says there, so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Did you see that? The moment God saw him looking and he had his attention on that bush is when God says, now I'm going to call your name. The cool thing is that God did not confuse him. God did not speak from the mountain. Moses, Moses, what was that? But this, you know what I'm saying? God is not like that. It was more like, you're focused on this, I'm going to use this to call your name. Because you're already on it. Your attention's on it already. You know what this brings me to say is sometimes as Christians, we kind of say, I'm afraid to miss the voice of the Lord. How do I know I didn't miss God's call in my life? Listen, you won't. You're not. The only thing that's going to miss that or cause you to miss it is sin. Because God has to deal with you with that first before anything else. But you're not going to miss the voice of God. You're not going to miss your calling. You're not going to miss God speaking to you. Why? Why do you say that, Robert? How do you say it so boldly? You know why? It's because look what happened with Moses. God worked this all out to bring Moses' mind to a place where God can speak. You may be a person who's very distracted. Your mind is all over the place. But listen, it doesn't mean that God cannot bring you to a one-focused mind. For you to focus on one thing, that's when God speaks. God is faithful. You're not going to miss it. And we see the same thing happen with Moses. Moses was distracted with the sheep, with the terrain, with everything. But God says, I'm going to bring that mind to that single focus. And once he steps into this and looks at this bush, that's when I'm going to get his attention. And he did. And here he's calling his name, Moses, Moses. Now, why did God call him twice? Was God stuttering? Moses, Moses. No, he wasn't. There's a purpose why God called his name twice. One is that it was a clear call to Moses. And when God called someone twice, it was because an important message was coming. God was about to communicate something extremely important. It was an important occasion of great importance. And we see that throughout the Bible where God called his people twice. Called their name twice because he was about to say something to them that was very important. So let me give you an example. In Genesis chapter 22:11, before Abraham was about to stab his only son Isaac, remember the story? As he was doing this, what happens? God says, Abraham, Abraham. I stopped him. Another area was in 1 Samuel 3, verse 10, God called Samuel twice. Samuel, Samuel. In Luke chapter 10, verse 41, remember Mary and Martha? Jesus called Martha how many times? Twice. Martha, Martha. You're so worried about so many things. In Luke chapter 22, verse 31, he calls Peter twice by his surname, his real name, Simon, Simon. In Acts chapter 9, we talked about that earlier, Saul, Saul. And in Matthew 23, verse 27, Jesus, with a broken heart, called out to his own city, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." But there's something else that I want to add to this. Repeating a person's name is an actual Hebrew expression of intimacy. When he called them twice by name, what God is saying is that I know you very intimately. I know who you are. God had a close relationship with all of the people he called twice. Moses, Abraham, Samuel, Martha. He knew them intimately. Which is an interesting thing because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 that many will come to him on that day and say what? Lord, Lord. Claiming intimacy with Jesus. And what did Jesus say? I never knew you. The word knew in the Greek means an intimate relation with that person. You know them intimately. And what Jesus is saying, I never knew you intimately. You never established a relationship with me. So don't say, Lord, Lord, as if you knew me intimately. That's scary, isn't it? You've had conversations with people where they say to you, oh, I'm a Christian. Oh, you know the Lord? Oh, yeah, I know the Lord. Of course. Then you see their lives and you're like, you don't know the Lord. Well, wait a minute. You got Christianity wrong. I mean, maybe I'm the one that's wrong. Am I supposed to do what you're doing? But people claim to know God intimately, but they really don't. And what a nightmare that will be when they get to that place in eternity, when they die, when their life expires on this side of heaven, and they're before Christ, and they're calling out to Jesus, Lord, Lord, claiming intimacy with him, and Jesus looks at them and says, I never knew you. Depart from me, what? Doers of iniquity. Oh my gosh. That's terrible. Guys, it's a trip when you read that because Jesus also added that there are two roads, right? One road leads to destruction and one road leads to life. One is a broad road, the other one is a narrow road. And you know what Jesus says? That many go towards the broad road and only a few travel on the narrow road. Jesus is already saying not everybody will choose God. That's sad. I wish it was the other way around. Only a few go in the broad road and many go in the narrow road, right? Jesus says, no, it's not that way. The sad reality is people send themselves to hell. The sad reality is that people choose not to follow God. And God gives them chances over and over and over and over, and they choose to just say, I am good with my life right now, God. I will come to church Sundays, but I will not go beyond that. I will stay on that broad road and trust that I will make it. Cross my fingers, as they say, right? And they're going to get to that place where they're going to say, Lord, but I cast demons in your name. I went to church in your name. I went to conferences in your name. Somebody gave me a Bible. I read John 3:16 in your name. And she says, but you never knew me. It doesn't matter. You never had a relationship with me. And we see very clearly that when God calls to Moses, Moses, it's because God had this intimate knowledge and relationship with Moses. I love what David said in Psalm 139. He says very clearly, God, you have searched me and known me. Isn't that awesome? God knows you. He knows me. And if you don't know him personally, oh, please do. Get yourself right with God and know him personally. Don't be those who are the many going on the wrong path. Stay on the few, on that narrow path. It's totally worth it, trust me. At the end of the day, you're going to see yourself in heaven while the others are going to be going to a place of destruction. And you're going to be like, whoo, thank you, Jesus. But see, we don't see that now. But we will soon. And so what does he do? Notice, so Moses, God calls him Moses, and notice it says, Moses said, here I am. That's a great response, isn't it? Should always be our response. We should never be like, uh-oh, or what do you want, Lord? It's, here I am. I love that willingness to hear God. And we see that Moses is not seeking God in this wilderness. It is God who seeks out Moses in the wilderness in a very intimate way. This divine moment with God. And notice in verse 5 what it says. Then he said, do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. How could this be holy ground? It's a desert, God. It's dirt, right? Now, if it was a marble floor, maybe you say holy ground, right? It's dirt. It's a barren desert. So why is this a holy ground when it's a barren desert? What makes this ground holy? You know what makes that ground holy? The presence of God. That's what it does. It makes it holy because of the presence. That's the whole point here. It's not about the ground. It's about the presence of God, because God was there. And so God tells him, take off your sandals. Why would he say that? You know, this was a custom that Moses was used to. When you would go before Pharaoh, you would have to take off your sandals because, according to them, he was like deity. It was a reverence, a respect towards Pharaoh. So Moses understood that custom, and God is using it, knowing Moses understood this very well, but he's doing it before the right king, isn't he? He's doing it before the creator of this universe, someone who is more powerful than Pharaoh, who deserves true reverence, right? And so he tells him to take off his sandals. And so we see here that he tells him, this is holy ground. Let me say this. Where God has you in life right now, whether you like it or not, if God is there, that is holy ground. Embrace it. If the Lord is where you're at and his presence is there, that is considered holy ground. Until the Lord moves you out of there and brings you to another spot. But right now, where you're at, just embrace it. If the Lord is in there, his presence is with you, listen, that is holy ground. Have reverence towards where you're at. Don't talk bad about your job. Don't talk bad about the place you're at right now in life. Listen, if the Lord is with you, that's holy ground. And we see this is happening with Moses. It was a desert. And he could have been like, God, what do you mean holy ground? This is dirty. This is crazy. There's a skull right here. What do you mean there's dirt? No, it's his presence. Doesn't matter what the surroundings are. And so we see very clearly that Moses, the first 40 years of his life were years of preparation. They weren't wasted years. God began to prepare his heart, and Moses knew the terrain which became the place of his employment. He knew everything around this place, and so God was preparing his heart for this. And then notice in verse 6 is when God reveals himself as the covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. I like what God says here. He says, I am, not I was. I am the God of Abraham. I'm still his God. What do you mean, God? It means Abraham is not dead. He's alive. I'm still his God. And God is still God, and he's alive. We have a God who was and is still to come, right? And so he reveals himself that not I was his God, I still am his God, and I will be their God still, and I'll be your God. They have passed away, but they're alive in my presence. And notice that Moses said he was afraid to look upon God. He covered his face. He knew that to look upon the full glory of God would mean the end of his physical life. And it says this in Exodus 33, verse 20, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. He knew that. You cannot see his face. You know, there's been revelations you see a lot of appearances of God before man, and the reaction or the response of man is always falling on their faces, right? There's a fear. There's a reverence, right? Even in the New Testament. That's why sometimes I have a hard time believing people when they say they saw Jesus in their bedroom. I've had people say, you know, God appeared to me yesterday, and I'm like, did you fall on your face? Did you get scared? No, I high-fived him. What? What are you talking about? I had a guy in Bible college a long time ago say to me that God appeared to him in his room, and that God told him that he was going to use him. And I was like, that's awesome. But you know what he said then? He said then his mind was better than Jesus. I'm like, what? This is a guy in Bible college. Hopefully he's not a pastor right now. People have these visions and appearances of God, but they're so irreverent towards it. You know what I mean? When I read in the Bible, when God revealed himself to people, man, people freaked out. It wasn't a normal thing. When people bring these stories to you, it's very subjective. I'm like, what'd you eat? Did you have something? I mean, what happened the night before? You know what I mean? You're tripping out, right? But notice, though, it says here in verse 7, as he says, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Notice the three words that I want to highlight here in verse 7. He says, I have seen, hear, and know. God has made it clear that he was fully aware of the state of his people. And you wonder if the children of Israel during that time thought that maybe God left them. He was far removed from them, uninvolved in their lives, rather than imminent. But he was directly concerned about them. He cared for them. God saw their heart. He's heard their cry. He knows their pain. And the same thing goes with you. Sometimes you feel like God is not hearing me. Does God really hear our heart? Does he really see what we're... Yes, he does. You remember Hagar in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, Abraham and Sarah, God promised them a child at their old age. It was very challenging for that, right? But then they just did not have the patience, and then Sarah says, hey, honey, can you go sleep with our maidservant and so we can have a child? And, Abraham's like, okay, honey, right? Abraham, seriously, dude? Happened. They had Ishmael. And then Sarah, who probably wouldn't be a good neighbor to have, she was one of those really tough women, really I don't know, she just was mean, right? She drove Hagar out. She got jealous and she drove her out, and she just really rebuked her. And so Hagar went with a broken heart, and she's traveling by herself with her child, and she's thinking, my life is wrecked. What do I do? I mean, I've been kicked out. And God, what happens? Appears to her, doesn't he? And has a conversation with her, comforts her, encourages her. And then she names that place this: you are the God who sees. That is something you need to understand, is that God sees your pain. God sees your fears. He knows your heart. He knows your doubts. He sees it. He's not blind. Why is he not coming to my rescue? Why is he not helping? Well, I don't know about that, but he does hear you and sees things. He perhaps teaching you a lesson through it. But God has a way to help you through it. And so we see that God reveals that to Moses, that listen, I know what's going on with my people. In verse 8 he says, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, when Moses is hearing this, probably at verse 8, he's like, oh, okay, cool. Wow, that's heavy, Lord. I'm sorry about your people. Wow, that's a bummer. I kind of know the area over there. And then verse 9 says, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come up to me. And he says, I have also seen their oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. And he says in verse 7, come now, therefore, and I will send you. Oh, wait, stop. Wait. Did you just say me? Wait a minute, Lord. My old boss? You want me to go back to who wants to kill me? They don't like me there. You want me to go back to him? Yep. See, I'm not just giving you information just so you know how my people are being mistreated. You're being called to be the deliverer. You know how old Moses was at this time? 80 years old. Could you imagine that conversation? Lord, are you serious? Think about it. What do I do here? Read the story, chapter 3. He put the brakes on, didn't he? He says, Lord, I'm not an eloquent speaker. And also says, you know what? You can't speak good. I'm going to have Aaron be your spokesperson. Oh, great. Okay, I can't go back. And you know the story. He ended up going back, and God did an incredible work, but it was hard, wasn't it? Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened it more. I mean, it was one of those crazy cycles where at first you're like, okay, God's going to use me. And then says, God's not using me. What's going on? It's not working. Lord, you called me to this. What's happening? But God had a plan. He was in control the whole time. Moses, relax. And here he is, saying, you are being called as a deliverer. In other words, you're leaving your job today. You're done shepherding, buddy. 40 years is enough. It's time for you to live another 40 years and go and deliver my people. And it wasn't just deliver them out, you lead them to the promised land. And unfortunately, he didn't make it, right? He had to go through crazy stuff with those people, with the children of Israel. And so Moses had 40 years of preparation, and now at 80 years old, the burning bush was a turning point in Moses' life. Wow. What an incredible conversation there, wasn't it? I want to close with two things here. I want to close with two applications. One, I want to encourage you Christians. I want to encourage my brothers and sisters here. Don't be discouraged with your life. Don't be discouraged with your life. Where God has you today is holy ground. Embrace it. If you want a new chapter in your life, you're just, there's a stir in your heart for just, Lord, I just want to move on from this job. I want to move on from this situation. Listen, God hears your heart, and perhaps that is something that God has put in you, so He's preparing you for a new challenge, a new adventure, perhaps. Stay faithful. Stay hopeful. Trust the Lord. God will show up at the right time. He showed up in Moses' life on an ordinary day, and it could be true for you as well.